Guys, good morning. How is everybody? We've got some new angles today. Who do we have here? We do have somebody. We've got Bert. Bert's here. Hello, Bert. How you doing, buddy? Guys, right. Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning into the show again. This is part 2 of leadership. This is the creative sessions. Myself and Dia today. We do have more guests coming on in case you're getting bored of us, but today it's just us. So we are talking about leadership. We had a really good response to last week's show. There was a lot of information that we put out there. We got some really good engagement. We had some good conversations around it. We feel that we've been building this agency now for quite a few years. You and I together for the last sort of 2.5. I set this up around about 9 years ago, so a few years of just kind of trial and error, really. No particular skill set to begin with, but just trial and error and experience over some time.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the best way of learning how to lead people. I think a lot of us sometimes, like you were saying earlier, is we read the books and we read the articles about the best practices in the market, but once you start implementing those practices that you really learn what works for you and what works for other people. And every one of us is a different leader, and I think understanding how do you want to lead your team and what makes you different as a leader is really important.
Yeah, look, it is 100%, and it all comes down to one of the things that we haven't spoken about here, and isn't necessarily on our topic list, is authenticity. And I do feel that when you are going through this process of, there's two sides to this when you're building a business and over time. There's the self-discovery, becoming more self-aware, as we were just discussing off camera a minute ago, and kind of understanding yourself more and more, where your strengths and weaknesses are. And then you become more effective in being able to communicate and engage with other people because you're more confident in your own space, and therefore you have a better ability to be able to communicate and be a lot more effective as a leader of groups. So I think authenticity is really, really key to that.
Definitely, and which I think brings us to our first point of today. Again, it's a continuation of the topic from last time about leadership and delegation. I feel like you get to a certain point when the team is big enough to be able to actually have the opportunity to delegate some tasks to your team, and there's many reasons for it. We see a lot of people who sometimes boss people around and give them orders, and that's not really delegation. It's more about sometimes even like running.
That's abdication, right? Yeah. That's abdication.
Exactly, and it's like even from a team's perspective, I was in a situation like this a few times in previous roles where I felt like, I'll probably just do this task at hand, and I'm not going to think about how I can actually be proactive.
Yeah.
So that limits even the motivation from the team side. But the kind of delegation we want to cover today is more on different drivers and different reasons for
reasons for delegation. Exactly that.
So first.
Well, as you start to build a team, you need to start to realize what your priorities are. As a leader, it's in the team's interest to make sure that the person that's leading the charge is spending the most time on those higher level tasks as possible. So there are multiple different reasons why you might delegate. We've spoken about sort of education and growth of a team member. We've spoken about maintaining focus. There's a whole range. I mean, the first one we'll talk about, let's say, is growth. So if you've got a team of people that you're working with, you have a set number of tasks. Firstly, you need to really focus on prioritizing that list and understanding that who is the most effective within your team at A, B, C, or D on your priorities list. And if A and B is yourself, because you have that particular skill set, then that's the work that you should be doing, not D, E, and F. You should focus on the things that you are best at and not focusing on things that are taking time away from that, because that is 100% in the interest of the team. If we relate this to growth, and you're trying to grow one of your team members, you need to start to realize that through delegation and allowing that ownership from that person, they will start to grow into a leader as well. So that's one of the most effective ways that you can grow somebody, is through effective delegation. But the key thing here is it's not delegation through I'm giving them this task because I don't want to do it, or it's a shitty task.
Yeah.
And that's just abdication. That's just giving somebody the crap jobs. So sometimes you should be giving them some of the best work to do, because you know that if they go into that meeting, you might be able to do that meeting 10% better because it's a big pitch meeting with a big client, and we've been in that position before. Yeah. We've walked in and gone, you know what? It's a huge piece of work. It could be a $1 million dirham contract. You're going in for a huge pitch. But sometimes it's the best move for the long term and the longevity of the business to allow somebody else to play point and play lead, and you sit back. And that growth it's been incredible to see.
I agree, and I think building confidence through delegation is something that we sometimes miss out on. Let's say for people who are in leading positions, like we said, there's many reasons to delegate, and the most important one for me is to try and grow the team through that delegation, which I feel like brings us nicely to our second point.
The second point being skill set, right? So as we briefly alluded to now.
And creating leaders as well, right? Through delegation. So
exactly that. But before we get through to that thing, the skill set thing is something that we should really sort of get across here. When we're starting to build a team, if you're authentic and self-aware as a person, and you and I do feel are both quite self-aware in terms of where our strengths and where our weaknesses lie. And as long as you don't have an ego that's trying to cover up for your weaknesses, and you're okay and you say, look, I'm really good in this space, I'm not very good in this space. And then as we start to build a team around us and we start to build a business, we're hiring people that are much better in a certain vertical than we are.
Sure.
So once you really understand that skill set, as you and I both know, then when it comes to a certain task, there might be somebody else in the business that's far more skilled at a particular role than we are. So another reason for delegation, another way to delegate is to really understand that where is your best skill set. Ego often gets in the way of this, right?
Yeah.
And we have seen this in the past before as well. You're like, I'm the leader. I should be doing
everything.
I should be doing this piece of work. When actually, if someone else is doing it, because
it's much better.
It's much better because they've got focus. And the problem of a leader is often not being focused enough because they're trying to do so many things. Yeah. So if you think, well, if I'm spending 60% of my time on this and someone else is spending 100% of their time, even if they don't have the correct skill set, are they going to do a better job than my 50 or 60%?
Probably yes.
And to be honest, the answer is often yes, right? So that's it's interesting.
It's also, like you said, is when you start hiring against the skill sets that you understand that you might lack or you might not be sort of an expert in. You would go far as a team, and it just reminds me of the saying that you can go fast alone, but you can go far as a team as well. So I think that's very true. That's one thing that to consider. And again, bringing us back to the second point of today is creating leaders through delegation, is being able to trust your team with those tasks. And like I said, if you're in a big pitch meeting, being okay with actually giving the lead to somebody else, because you know that by doing that, you're actually creating leaders in the making. And I think, building confidence in our team is something that takes time. And it's not something that we can expect as well overnight. We can see potential sometimes in some people, but knowing that, there's being in that leader role, whether they're leading 2 people or 3 people, it takes time and it takes understanding and it takes practice at the same time.
Exactly that.
Also from, let's say, the commander in chief, let's say from top positions, you've got to be patient with those that you see the potential in and realize that it's not about this one time that you give them an opportunity to lead, and maybe they don't do the right thing at the first time, but understanding that you've got to believe in the growth time frame that it takes.
Yeah, look, I fully agree with that, and a true leader needs to have the humility to also be a follower, and that comes from having humility, having self-awareness that you're not the best at everything. And if you have that humility as a leader to say, right, well, this person is better positioned than I am to make this decision and to lead this particular task, and you have the humility to follow that person even though they're within your team, then that will allow you to, as you say, grow other leaders within the business. If you have multiple leaders across the business, you have a strong company.
Yeah.
Different clients will engage with different areas of your business. If there's leadership across each of the different groups, you're able to grow because there isn't this bottleneck of the person at the top, the commander-in-chief, as you put it, having to make every key decision. Sure. So by delegating and allowing different leaders to grow and own their space, and the ownership is really key here. They have to feel that they own the vertical that they're in and that they are the leader. It also comes down to something called, something I picked up from a book recently, the Jocko Willink, The Dichotomy of Leadership. It's something called commander's intent. Now, what commander's intent means in a military context is when you have a briefing before they go out to do whatever they need to do, there's a very clear communication around what the commander's intent is. So therefore, that's a framework for decision making. Yeah. So then every sub-leader that's in their vertical that has to then make a decision at some
Based
point
on that framework,
doesn't have to phone up the commander-in-chief and be like, oh, by the way, how should I do this or how should I do that? They understand what the end goal is. They understand the framework of decision-making is to try and get us from A to B. So now this leader is facing a certain scenario, and they can then make the decision to be like, well, does it get us closer to B, which is, I know, the overall mission? Then if the answer is yes, they can make that decision themselves. So if we're able to grow different leaders through different verticals, and then overlay that commander's intent so everybody understands why we're trying to do certain things. That will allow the business to be very, very strong and also be able to grow a lot faster. And we've seen this. I mean, we have account directors on certain businesses, and there's certain accounts that you and I might not necessarily be that involved in, but they're very significant to the business. And it's only because those leaders that are in those different verticals are able to make decisions because they know overall what we're all trying to achieve, right?
Exactly, 100%.
Exactly
and I think that's really important to communicate. And as somebody in a leading position, like to be able to give the people the framework and trust to take the business into a certain direction, you've got to over-communicate, which is a nice sort of transition to our clear communication point. If you're a leader, how much really of your sort of strategy that you've probably spent days creating for your company, how much of that are you actually rippling down to every single person in the company and communicating also the reasons why the strategy is important for everybody, because we're all in the same boat here. So like understanding it, not just telling people what the strategy is and where we want to go, but like the reasons why we want to go to that place and what it means to the business if we are there or not, because it will affect everybody on the boat. So
very much so. I think clarity of communication, although it sounds quite simplistic, it's a lot more difficult than people actually realize. It involves having a lot of quite difficult conversations. It involves being sometimes quite brutally honest with people, and that might ruffle some feathers, that might cause those uncomfortable conversations. It might demotivate people sometimes, but it's about the way that message is delivered. But I do think 100%, I know that in the long run, that clarity of communication and the clarity of feedback, when somebody's done something wrong or is just going down a path that you believe is not the route that the company should be going down, the very clear communication of this is the feedback as to what's gone wrong, and this is why we're making this decision that this is the wrong path, and overly communicating that, as you say. Then everybody walks away, and even if it's an uncomfortable conversation, everybody walks away from that meeting thinking, okay, I understand why I'm going wrong. I understand what I need to change. So it's about being constructive. And often, I know that you might not necessarily agree, but often removing the emotion from that conversation, that side of things, because as soon as you bring too much emotion into that conversation, people might feel like they're being attacked. But if it's a very clear framework of this is why I believe this, and this is how we need to change course, and this is the clarity of feedback, and these are the actions I expect, and everybody walks away from that thinking, okay, well, this is the direction I need to go in.
So the reason why, I mean, initially we had this conversation offline, and the reason why maybe I was leaning towards a bit more emotion with specifically over communicating or being very clear about communication is it can come across as you are, being bossy, or you can also come across as maybe being, a bit of an asshole, really. Like when imagine like you're sitting on a table, and I fully agree that sometimes the intent is very pure, but then if you're being very direct, the only thing I would say is just to think about the way that the message is being delivered. Like you said, the blunt. I mean, to be honest, maybe sometimes for me it's a bit of a challenge to be like completely emotionless in delivery of information, but it's being able to.
No, I mean, you mustn't be emotionless, right? Because people still need to, that's how people engage, is through the emotional connection of what you're saying. But it's just about not being
like overly emotional.
As soon as somebody starts raising their voice, they become overly emotional. Then you lose. Well, to be honest, you lose the connection, and you lose the authority, and people will sit back and be like, I'm switching off from this. I'm not willing to receive this information because this person is delivering it in a way that I believe is
almost like an attack.
Exactly. So that clarity of communication, really finding, again, going back to this book, this dichotomy of leadership, it's okay, you need to have emotion, but then you also need to not deliver with too much emotion when you're having a more difficult conversation. So it's finding that balance between the two. And that's often the case with leadership, is finding the balance between being connected, but disconnected, delegating, not micromanaging, and it's just finding the balance between the two. Because if you delegate completely and you don't then oversee, then you might actually be abdicating leadership, and then you've got no idea what's going on. So it's always about this balance between one and the other.
And it's a practice. I feel like a lot of us, and I've seen a lot of leaders get disconnected from their team because, like you said, they're over delegating or they're really disconnected from what's going on. So it's always rechecking with yourself. What is the status of your, let's say, engagement with the team, and what is your status of what the team also thinks of you? So like you said before, you've got to be okay to be a follower, to be a good leader. So
you have to have that humility, right? You have to have that humility.
And check in with yourself.
one of the tools that we have with regards to communicating within teams, which we found that's just crucially important, it comes from Tony Robbins, actually. I was at a Tony Robbins event about 2.5 years ago, something like that. It was called Business Mastery. It was a 3 or 4 day event. And one of the things that I took away from this, and it was really interesting, the actual background story that Tony delivered and why this was so critical within his business. And it almost put him out of business because of one simple piece of paper. The concept's called clarify and verify. And what that means, if you really break it down, is that there's two parties. One's trying to communicate with another. And it's the ownership of that communication by both parties. One has to clarify that the other party has understood that message, and then has to verify. So both parties have to clarify and verify. So if, let's say, even if a very important email is sent, it's about then following up and checking within a few hours if there's no response. Did you receive that email? Yes, I did. Okay, here are the actions. This is what's happening. If it's an email of that importance. So it's just making sure that there's ownership from both sides to clarify and verify exactly what the messaging is. Now, when we've been in meetings and we've had to give feedback on a certain situation, what we've often done is we've sat in the meeting, we've delivered what we needed to say, we've had the conversation with the team member or the group of people, and then we've said, right, now repeat this back to us. Tell us what's going to happen next. And often when you hear that information back, you'll be okay, this is what I understood and this is what I'm going to do. And you're like, wow, there's a big disconnect of what I just said. And that you must take ownership that's your fault, because you obviously haven't communicated properly. But if you don't do that and that clarify and verify, and in that process, I said 2 parties would have walked away. One party thinks this is exactly what's happening, and the other party thought this is exactly what's happening. And because they haven't clarified and verified, they go off and not do different things, and then it's not happening. Agreed. So there's a really clear tool just to make sure that if you're communicating something that's very important, ask that person to then tell you exactly what's going to happen next from their perspective. And if you're aligned, you're good to go. If you're not aligned, and I guarantee if you start doing this, you will see there is big disconnect between how you're communicating and how people are actually perceiving and understanding.
So I think, you know, when we are in, we're getting phone calls on the show now. So in case I didn't,
every week we seem to have phone calls. Quick, Sharon, pick up the phone. So call-in show.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be cool, actually. We should integrate a bit of a.
We should do a call-in show. Maybe we'll do that in the next few weeks. We'll do a call-in show. So then we'll stage it. We'll get Nadeem to call us.
So basically, I think, you know, you've been in this sort of like leading a business for much longer, and I feel like there has been situations where it hasn't been all, you know, great for the business, and even on a personal level as well. So what do you think is the main driver that keeps you going and keeps you really that gets you out of the you know, the shitty situations where maybe your targets aren't being met, maybe the performance of the business isn't where it should be. And I've faced this earlier, you know, in the business as well, and it's these crowd they really want to get hold of us today. So I think the question there is, what is the one, let's say, commodity from a leader's perspective that will get you through a tough situation?
Look, for me, it's pretty clear. It's passion, because there's only so far motivation will take you, right? And the way that I see it is motivation is push. And you're pushing yourself to get out of bed. You're motivating yourself to push yourself to deliver that work and keep working until midnight and early hours of the morning sometimes to get that work done. But passion is actually pulling you. So if you find what that passion is and you really sort of, you double down and you engage in that space, your passion will pull you, whereas motivation is pushing you. And I think that's absolutely critical to as we talk about, if you're trying to build a rocket ship, you're trying to build a business that's fast growing, that's delivering, that's an anomaly, you need to put in an exceptional amount of work. So if you're trying to build this rocket ship, you need to understand that you're going to be working your ass off, and it's going to be to the detriment of many other areas of your life. Now, if you're not fully passionate about doing that project,
you're going to run out of gas.
100% you're running out of gas. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how motivated you are. You will run out of gas. So passion is the answer.
Definitely, and I think that will drive the consistency as well, because like we know, it requires and day in, day out of the same amount of effort, the same amount of you know, focus and again, passion and delivery. But even another layer to passion, what I believe is being able to be creative and being able to stand out from the crowd and really think ahead of the group of people that you've got around you as well. As a leader, it is your responsibility to know what's coming next and in what space you want to be pulling in your team, whether that's from, you know, back in the day, us talking about vertical video, and then seeing that adopted through with our clients as well, and the importance of certain techniques or certain sort of applications and strategies that we apply to the clients. So just be careful with the stand that's going to fall.
Okay, that's why it keeps slipping. That's what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
well, we're almost at the end of the show, so we'll just hold it by here.
If somebody can hold the stand.
But look, the other side to passion is about authenticity, right?
Yeah.
So if you're trying to lead a team of people, if you're trying to lead a business, a leadership group, any group of people, you have to be absolutely authentic.
Yeah.
And people will only buy into your vision, your shared vision across the business, if they believe that you're authentically aligned with what you're trying to say. Sure. And that only comes from being passionate about what you're saying, right? So if you don't have that passion, you won't have the authenticity in leadership, and you won't be able to motivate your team members to actually join you on this on this shared vision.
Sure. Agreed. And I think that's a nice way to wrap up this week's episode. Thanks a lot for tuning in.
Thank you very much.
And hopefully by the coming weeks, we'll be inviting a lot more guests on the show.
We do have some very interesting guests on the list.
Yeah.
Jen is speaking to a lot of interesting people. So we're looking forward to seeing how that grows.
If somebody's watching and you feel like you can add something to the show, then please get in touch with us. I think we'd love to have you on board. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Until next week. See you.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for tuning in on Instagram as well. It's an absolute pleasure. Got a few people waving there. I appreciate that. Thanks a lot. And let's catch up soon. See you next week.